In what may be my magnum opus of videos here, I will walk you through what exactly will be the cost of deportation and remigration. Now, I want to distinguish some things here when we start in a bit of a preamble, and to say that there are many compounding factors to immigration, and the type of immigrants that have chosen to move to different countries varies in their socio-economic value. So we try to be very concrete and with respect to data as statistically accurate as possible when we deal with this kind of topic, because I think it is unduly or unfair if we start treating it a bit more lax and with a bit more leeway, whereas I want to be very, not scientific, but very accurate at least. And the more precision and the more assiduousness we can use here, obviously the better the conversation will be. Now, in saying that, I would like to start with two things. The distinction first is that there are two principles of illegal immigration. One is you have a wall or a moat or some form of force to stop people from coming. The second element is the people who have arrived, you get rid of them. So there are two policies here. One is a strong border, enforced usually through might of arms, as well as defensible emplacements, immune to saboteurs. And then on the other hand, you have a mechanized and weaponized bureaucratic system, which is capable of deportation and remigration, repatriation of undesired peoples. Now, this could be anything from illegal immigrants to failed asylum seekers and refugees, to any number of overstayers of visas. There are a range of characters who would probably be liable and required to be deported. The two things here are important as well in relation to this, and the corollary to that is we bear the costs of deportations in the West as taxpayers. We don't make them foot the bill, albeit we could attempt to, and that can be a negotiation done with the second country, so not the destination country, but the repatriation country. And secondly to that, I think it's important to understand that the costs involved differ in how we think about them and how the media reports on them. So it's very important that we conceptualize what economic costs mean here. And this is very, very important, I think, for us. And particularly in this video, I'll go through exactly why it's important. So we have known that walls are very effective and moats, oceans are very effective at keeping out undesirable people who would pose a threat to us. Hadrian here quite eloquently said that he would wish to keep intact the empire because it had been imposed upon him via divine instruction. I think that should tell you everything you need to know about the nature of having a border and a defensible demarcation of your territory. It is the essential element to having a state, and the sovereignty of your nation is only protected by borders. That's it. That's the delineation on a map of this is my country and my state. The sovereignty is represented by the people who live here and in the sovereign themselves who governs that territory. The Prince by Machiavelli talked into this concept and one of legitimacy in a way that propounds exactly the idea of a state and that its boundaries represent who it is. And we can go more into that, but there's a telluric element to this one. So the secondarily to that is the Berlin Wall is a good example. That was a very effective wall built around Berlin, East and West Berlin during the time of the Cold War. And once it was erected, it had a 75% drop of people fleeing from what was East Germany to West Germany, effectively. So you can see that walls are very effective. And the reasons for people fleeing usually come down to more complex reasons. And I won't go into those because I think that's a bit of a fox trap in terms of whether or not you'll muddy the water of the discourse. What I want to do is play on this level playing field of what exactly is the process for deportation. If I was hired tomorrow by the UK government or by the EU government or by America to be in charge, I would be the deportation Führer, then what would that mean and what exactly would I need to think about in terms of, yes, you have to do this, this, and it's going to cost this. So contextually, we can understand that there's very many illegal immigrants in the EU, the UK, and the US. I think it's easy to understand why. We're prosperous countries whereby we have a lot of desirable material available outcomes. So you can have jobs, healthcare, these things. But then there's also a welfare state, and that goes into free money. And to someone who doesn't have that much money, free money is very appealing, obviously. And thus we have a large influx of illegal immigrants. This goes also into human trafficking. We've been huge sources of human trafficking for reasons that go from drug dealing to prostitution, etc. Then there's also a lot to do with marriages and trying to bypass certain legality around consanguineous marriages. So particularly with expats from the Middle East and Africa, there's a lot of cousin marriages, and to do this you get around it by marrying outside, and then you bring them in a way that you don't disclose. So you're technically lying on your applications, and obviously that would be illegal if we bothered to persecute such things. There's also a range of other criminal/terroristic elements to immigration, whereby we don't have good data systems in the third world, thus can't provide you with evidence of somebody's past, and that will obviously sometimes haunt the modern society in the way that their actions are just reflections of their character, and we didn't know enough about their character. In any case, I think it's just important to preface the whole statement that we can actually calculate these costs to a fairly accurate degree. It's never going to be by the penny, but I think in general we get a fair understanding of what a process will cost because of the elements and the variables that go into it. That we have discourse at the moment whereby you have on one side of the fence people telling you it's too expensive and or don't worry about doing it because the value today of the exact amount is too much. It's incalculable. When we know it's not, but it's such a large proportion of the GDP that it warrants second thought about whether it's a smart policy. I think firstly you say no policy should be determined by fiscal grounds alone. We should determine social and economic policies by the value that they bring for the people who experience the output. So if society is determined to buy something which doesn't actually return anything material, so we could say we're going to invest in parks and public spaces, whereby we know there's an element of satisfaction that's raised in the public populace, but we're not going to quantify that to a degree. Now you could maybe make an economic argument about the total reward for a park, but in general, if you just think of the thesis that some of these measures cost money and don't necessarily have a rate of return or a rate of invested return on this. Second to this is you have a large segment of the populace which is now involved in what is second or underclass, or you could call it black or grey market employment, whereby they're using undocumented and illegal immigrants, illegal aliens, anyone who's in the country without the proper permits, to work and pay them what is equivalent to less than minimum wage, and thus breaking the law, and or paying cash and thus not paying taxes. So you have a grey economy or a black market economy here, which we're encouraging basically by permitting this to go on without retribution. I'm a big fan of justice, and I would say that this is not just. It's a very neglectful government that prioritizes business and economic output from the wealthy whilst potentially punishing and being at least neglectful of their own under or unemployed. So you'll have always a natural level of unemployment. It's called structural unemployment, and you'll have some frictional unemployment, but these things can be assuaged if you have smart policy around enabling people to work and be productive. Allowing a bunch of illegal immigrants to come in and take jobs and then say, oh yeah, but you wouldn't want to take these jobs anyway, is both farcical and a little bit an affront element to this. And I can see why there'd be umbrage if you were in that lower class, because you have had most of your opportunities for what is just a basic minimum wage, whilst you maybe try to pursue study or other opportunities evaporated in front of you by poor policymakers and a weak, limp-wristed government. So in saying that, because as I said, there has to be quite a lot of prefacing here because you can't just delve into this topic. The third part is you have a lot of these think tanks in America and the UK in particular, whereby you might say that they're progressives, and progressives in the, I would say, pejorative sense here, where they're very spineless and weak and illogical people sitting around kumbaya, holding hands, thinking and wishing. And this is back to a Boomer video I did where we can say that they live their lives in wishful thinking, and this is ought to be land. Everything ought to be like this. And it's the rootless urban intellectual that's responsible for these things. I'll just read a summation that they have in one of their policy documents around the American deportations. And they've said, in total, we find that the cost of a one-time mass deportation operation aimed at both those populations, an estimated total is at least 315 billion. We wish to emphasize that this figure is a highly conservative estimate. It does not take into account the long-term costs of a sustained mass deportation operation or the incalculable additional costs necessary to acquire the institutional capacity to remove over 13 million people in a short period of time. Incalculable because there is simply no reality in which a singular operation is possible. For one thing, there would be no way to accomplish this mission without mass detention as an interim step. To put the scale of detaining over 13 million undocumented immigrants into context, the entire US prison jail population in 2022, comprising every person held, local, county, state, and federal prisons and jails, was 1.9 million people. In order to estimate the costs of a longer-term mass deportation operation, we calculated the cost of a program aiming to arrest, detain, process, and deport 1 million people per year, paralleling the more conservative proposals made by mass deportation proponents. Even assuming that 20% of the undocumented population would self-deport under a years-long mass deportation regime, we estimate the ultimate cost of a longer operation would be average out to 88 billion annually for a total cost of 967 billion over the course of more than a decade. This is much higher sum than the one-time estimate given the long-term cost of establishing and maintaining detention facilities and temporary camps to eventually be able to detain 1 million people at a time. Costs that could not be modelled in a short-term analysis. This would require the United States to build and maintain 24 times more ICE detention capacity than currently exists. The government would also require to establish and maintain over 1,000 new immigration courtrooms to process people at such a rate. Now, I think obviously they're making the argument here against deportation, but I haven't actually heard an argument against deportation. All they've said is it would be difficult and cost a lot. But once again, that's no reason not to do something. There are a lot of things that are difficult and will cost a lot, but they make my life better. I still do them. They're not necessarily things that dissuade me in a way that's, okay, so it costs a lot and it's hard. So is life. Life costs a lot and it's hard. I still want to get the better version of that. And I think in general that they are obviously trying to utilize what is a large number thrown at you to say, look, $1 trillion, this should worry you. This is an obscene amount of money to spend on this one thing. And I'll say, okay, and some people I think online have pointed out that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were something like 5 trillion or some obscene number. So that alone I think is worthless in terms of apples to apples. But I would say, what is it exactly that you're getting for $1 trillion? Are you getting $1 trillion worth of a better country? Because why wouldn't you pay that? If it's a one-to-one dollar, if you're saying our country is actually 1 trillion times better off, or like $1 trillion worth better off, isn't that good value for money? Isn't that what you're getting, what you're paying for? So what's the problem? Because, and I'll go into it, it's actually cheaper to deport them, and I'll show you why. But I think just from a logical argument, there's very weak and a facile way of arguing here, where they've just gone by the numbers of, here you go, now get scared and don't do this. Which I don't find a very effective way of arguing, to be fair. I think, to clue you in, there's a large diaspora of illegal immigrants from basically what is in America, Central and Southern America. So the countries you're deporting them to are actually quite close by. You don't have the issue like Europe does, where Afghanistan is another half continent over. Most, I would say, of these people here, you can see a Mexican or other, and probably the other has something to do with the Caribbean islands, and then also something around second-generation immigration from post-Soviet countries and things like that. But what I'll do though is I'll sit with you and I'll walk you through the calculations that I've been doing and show you how exactly we can afford in all of these countries to do this, why we'd want to, and what exactly that means. So in the first part of the exercise, we want to base our argument a lot on the same lines. First, as I said before, there's two policies here. There's actually a strong border that you need. You can't have more immigrants coming in while you're trying to deport the existing ones. You need there to be a reasonable amount of slowdown. And I would say that this is very possible. We can look at a policy report here by which we show Australia was able to stop boats using policy to basically zero in 2001. And anything after here you can see is a reflection of a lenient policy and allows for the more encouragement in general of boats to be coming. And then you have a correspondent increase in number of arrivals. And then obviously, once again, if you're strict on your policy, it goes back down to zero. Humans are very basic in this. It's not very hard to understand the game theory behind the choices made here. The same thing happened in the EU, where you had a lot of illegal immigrants, particularly after Brexit, where they all picked and chose where they wanted to go. Most of them stayed in the UK, and then the remainder you'll find scattered throughout because of the resettlement strategy that the EU pursued for bizarre reasons. So in general, the weak border of the EU was made evident in 2015 in particular, but obviously before that there was still loads of illegal immigration from the Middle East and Africa, and some parts of Asia, South Asia in particular, India, Pakistan, places like that. And then we can go into how much that costs, and it costs because if you have an illegal immigrant, they live here. Most of the time they're provided housing, which is a bizarre way to go about encouraging people. They're also offered pocket money and or welfare to a degree. They'll have healthcare, they'll have any education requirements. We pay their legal fees, we pay their administrative fees, everything that's required to be processed. Because we have had such expansive asylum seeker and refugee programs, these things are by the default given to anyone who applies in any way. Usually it's meant to be legal at a port of entry, but now obviously it's completely done away with the facade here. What we have though is the idea that all of these costs are borne contemporaneously from your arrival to your living and existence in a country. So the taxpayer is footing the bill, necessarily so through a budget set by the government. The government's encouraging these things because they're providing them. If you do not provide housing, there will not be people coming because they will be living on the street and they won't want to do that. If you start giving them money for shopping and food, then they will still be further encouraged. And then if you give them the glimmering hope of a permanent residency or citizenship, then obviously there's a huge incentive to stay, and then why would I ever leave? And in general, the longer you're here, the more your network you build, as I said before, in that grey and black market, and you can have just jobs selling drugs or delivering Uber Eats. The estimations here, so you can see some numbers, but that 59% of American households with illegal immigrants were on one of the major welfare programs, and that's costing up to $42 billion a year. And I think this is mostly federal, so this could obviously be higher in state welfare programs. The estimated cost of educating the children of foreigners is $70 billion. So your kids are getting less education because more of it's being spent on kids who are not part of a residency program. And then obviously there's a total calculus here, which they've done for us, and they've said on average $68,000 per year is the deficit. So the fiscal drain of an illegal immigrant family is $68,000. Now, there is no economic argument in the world that would tell you to continue to do this because it does not cost $68,000 to deport someone. In no world is that true, unless you were deporting one person a year and the administrator in charge, that's their salary, or some bizarre scenario. In any functional capacity where we can understand that America was able to remand and encamp almost its entire Japanese population before World War II, or like during World War II, in like less than 6 months. And maybe that was only 150,000, but you can get it done super fast. There's no way that the government, when it has a will and a way, lacks the capacity. Secondly, you have something called scales of economy, and the economy of scales here shows you that after every increase in a unit, it becomes cheaper if the fixed and variable costs differ. So economically, this is where we can start talking a bit more deeply, and to say that you in an investment, or when you spend money on something to do, you'll have a fixed cost element and you'll have a variable cost element. Fixed costs are things that are upfront and they can be thought of as a capital expense. But if you have to buy a computer, that'll be an upfront cost, and that's fixed. You buy it one time and you have it now forever, ostensibly. Whereas the variable cost on something like a computer might be power. So every time you turn it on, you're charged power. So the operating cost of the computer is electricity, and that will be then this cost of X or whatever you might think. And so that's how we can start to think about all these programs, is that they'll have a fixed cost element up front, and then they'll have a continual variable cost. The variable cost element could be very high at the start for these programs, because maybe you need certain expenditures around headcount and FTEs, so people responsible for different roles. But that person's capacity might be, they may be able to manage, say, 10 deportations or 10,000. But if you're only having them deport 100 people, you can see that their capacity is not met. And so their variable cost is very high, because you're having a much lower base of people responsible for their salary. This can also be true for equipment and all these other things which require, if you've got a bus that's only 1/3 full, transporting people back to the border, then obviously that's going to be not the most efficient way, and the variable cost will be higher there. This can be reduced into something like what we say a short-term and a long-term economies of scale. And you can see how the calculation is done. It's just very simple calculus here in terms of the changes in the capex to the demand, and then you can have what the cost augmentation would look like. So I think it's hopefully somewhat intuitive if you've got Year 12 calculus to see that there's a marginal change, and the marginal change is something that's reflected in a lowering of the costs, or at something at scale. All of these programs at scale will be cheaper. It's why things usually, and I won't say normally are in government, usually for a business, you want to produce more things in a factory because you can get them cheaper and make them cheaper at scale. It's why car companies don't want to make 10 cars because they're very expensive to make 10 cars. They want to make 10 million cars because it's much cheaper to be able to scale a business on a per car basis, the cost. And so that brings us to our fun little calculation here, where we will say, how do we think about the costs in these three regions to deport and remigrate X many people? I've taken here two versions of numbers. The first number here, you can see 1.2 million illegals in the UK. It's actually more like 5 from most of the sources that I can find. So this is an understated number. This is the official government policy number, but we all know policy agents don't necessarily have great investigatory skills. Then you'll have in the US about 13, which is actually more like 30, which is actually probably even higher, but we'll just be very conservative here and say 13. And then the EU has 1.3, and this is definitely much higher, particularly if you go Eastern Europe and places like that, then you're talking much grander double magnitude style numbers there. And then you can actually find how much we are spending. Most governments will report their costs for the year on some certain programs. They will limit these costs in the budget to say the cost of direct spend on an immigrant or an illegal immigrant was X, or an asylum seeker, or whatever nonsense they're calling it now. The American one is about 400 billion. So there's a 400 billion cost as the upper range. They've said it's 150, but once again, it's a split between state, local, and federal governments. There's also some externalities, and I like to include externalities because when you're doing a study, it's worth including all the variables that go into whether or not something's important. And that would have to include prisons, opportunity cost to hiring local people. So you would have a bigger tax base if the employer was forced to hire a citizen and pay them obviously a payroll tax, and that then person paid income tax, and they also had flow-on tax in terms of pension and accruement and things like that. Then you have pollution and infrastructure usage amongst many other things here. You have to understand what the broad breadth of having more people in a society does to the strained resources of that society. So in any case, this is what you can think of in terms of the total. So I think the 400 billion is actually fair. I don't think this 150 billion is is reasonable. And so what we'll do is we'll plot the costs of an illegal immigrant and to the country itself. So the UK has reported having 60 billion pounds as the cost to their economy, having to house 1.2 million illegal immigrants. So the cost per immigrant is about £50,000 per year. The cost to deport, and this is a government sourced report, by the way, is about 25k. Here in the government report, they've argued for a £22,000 reflight package, but that was to a third country and included 3 flights. So I sensibly, I think, said we're going to do 1 flight, and it's going to be from location A to location B. That's it. And that's still going to cost what was equivalent to about £7,000. And from that, I think we can just assume that the rest of these costs have been overstated to a large degree, but we will go with their detention costs and some administrative costs. So we're saying the total cost to deport is £25,000 by Her Majesty's government, or His Majesty's government, sorry, which is a very efficient machine here. We also, and I think is important to include, aid to the third world here. So the British government spends £12 billion a year on third world aid, as in providing direct monetary and fiscal promotion to countries who are underdeveloped by their definitions. So I would say that this is actually a deportation calculus, because why am I paying a country to send their people to live in my country? That for me would be a disqualification of any of aid that would be paid. And I would want my money back. And so I consider this now part of my budget, because once again, I'm in charge. So I'm the, as I said before, the Caesar here. We have a debt rate. This is just used for the deportation costing, where we just say if we borrowed all of the money that it cost to deport all of these people, and in that would be about 10 billion pounds or something like that, then you have effectively what is a payment back. And this is of just interest payments, because we will say the principal's a wash. So the principal payment is 1-to-1, so it's immaterial to this calculation. So the costs in terms of interest payments are about 3.8 billion here for the UK. And I think when we start to look at the efficiencies of scale, so if you gave me the task of deporting all these people in, say, 5-year time frame, I think 1.2 million is reasonable to deport 250,000 per year. Then you would be able to, and this is in conjunction with, as I said, a combination of a strong border, which does not let in immigrants who are not of the right papers, then you do get what is equivalent to 15,000 pounds, I would say, is probably quite a good estimate of what I could get a running costs of this type of business to be. And I don't think that's very much more than ICE. And this is a 2016 study, showed that they would, the total cost for them is about $13,000. But I think we could get it down to £15,000. I think we're an efficient machine. The British Empire was able to deport loads of people to Australia at what was a reasonable cost at the time. I don't think it's deeply unnecessary for us to overcomplicate these things. You put people in a centre, you tell them your plane takes off tomorrow, and then they leave. That's it. There's not that much to this. The number of, I think the biggest issue, sorry, this is an aside, the biggest issue that they keep calculating here is legal costs. And I think the only reasonable way to action legal costs is if you perform them in the country that the person is from. So they stay there at their own country on their own dollar. We send them home, and we process their applications there. And you'll find most of them don't end up disappearing because they're not actually being persecuted. But that's fine. That's not my problem. Then we can say for the US, the calculation is very similar. You can see what my process was. The US also pays about $61 billion to the third world, which is an egregious amount. And then the cost of deportation is not even 1/3 of an annual aid bill. And as I said before, so if there's $400 billion total cost per year to your economy from illegals, are we really so upset about 24 billion in interest payments? Is that really the argument? Because obviously for me that calculus is fairly easy. Even if you 10x'd, you said, you're not being fair, you've undercalculated, you're not including whatever random variables you're throwing at me, and I'm going to ignore crime, and I'm going to ignore the instances of overusage of core and critical infrastructure and energy systems and telecommunication systems, etc., and I'm going to say that you're BSing here with your economic background. Then I would say, okay, so say it's 240 billion. and this is only 150. Once you remove these people, they are no longer this drag. There is no longer, so proportionally, if 13 million people are costing 150 billion a year, and you halve that, then you've halved it down to 75 as a cost, and then 75 is still already paying for the differences. You see how that works, right? So the argument falls quite flat when you just consider it from an economic perspective. And I won't bother with running through the EU one. You can pause the video and look at it. But I think in general, that's the core thesis of my argument here. It's to say, economically, and in consideration, full consideration of everything socio-economically, which includes the welfare of citizens, how they are able to feel safe in their own countries that they pay tax to, how they are able to educate their own kids only with their own tax dollars, and what their process is around being able to provide, because we have a surplus in our own wealth, aid to these third world countries as a luxury, is now you're forced upon this system of paying billions and billions of dollars a year to process applications of what is amounting to liars, people who have lied about the application of why they're here and what they want. I'm not going to blame anyone from wanting a better life. I think that's a natural human instinct. But what I will say, it takes a very naive and boomer wishful thinking utopian ideal of what society should look like for us to have ever gotten into this situation in the first place. It is a rank and utter, or I am of this belief at least, that you could be so incompetent and so myopic around these decisions on policy, and that we would ever vote for anyone who was for these things. It boggles my mind. I just do not understand who sat there and thought, yes, illegal immigrants are a good idea, let's never push back. And maybe you can go harken this back to Reagan and his weasel way of attempting to pacify and placate all of these people, but it is such a distinct and distasteful policy that it could not do anything but cause disruption and chaos. And I think from that, and obviously you can sense my antipathy towards asylum seeker and illegal immigrant policies, because they are fraudulent in the way that they're designed, and you're incentivizing people's worst instincts here. And I think that is such a shame for maybe what would have been a few hundred people a year who are genuine refugees versus people who are just trying to con, you would say, naive and maybe bleeding heart liberals.